Two planes carrying 349 people speed towards each other in the evening skies above Delhi. In one of those planes, 5 pilots sit at the controls, making preparations to land. In the other, 3 pilots are climbing along their departure route. An air traffic controller sits at the top of a tower, watching 2 blips on his screen draw closer together. What do these things have in common? The people immediately in charge of the outcome, those sitting in the pointy ends of these structures, also sit at the pointy end of a vast and complex infrastructure which undergirds their actions. All of these systems and infrastructures make up the foundations for the pyramid of aviation safety, on top of which pilots and air traffic controllers sit. What you're about to see is the shocking story of what happens when the foundations of this pyramid are rotten. On the evening of November 12th, 1996, 289 passengers and 23 crew stepped on board a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 in Delhi, India. They were bound for Dadran International Airport in Saudi Arabia, a 4-hour journey. Many of the passengers were migrant workers, headed for construction and hospitality jobs in the Gulf. Flight 763 was the beginning of a long journey for them. As they settled into their seats, a few hundred kilometers to the northwest, another group of passengers was descending towards Delhi, getting ready for a much shorter trip to the Indian capital. Most of the 27 passengers on board Kazakh Flight 1907 were traders, preparing for a shopping trip to Delhi. Their plan was to buy up as much cheap textiles as they could, and to fill the plane up with them for the return journey to Kazakhstan a few days later. For several strange reasons which we'll explore in a moment, these two sets of passengers would come closer together than ever intended. But at least initially, as the Kazakh plane began its descent and the Saudi plane was loaded with passengers and baggage, all was normal. In command of Saudi Flight 763 was 45-year-old Captain Khalid al-Shubaili. With just short of 10,000 hours of flying time, he was a highly experienced pilot. He had flown this route many times before, and was familiar with the peculiarities of Delhi's airspace at the time. Sitting to his right was Nazir Khan, an American captain who would be acting as first officer on this flight. He was 44 years old and was also very experienced, with more than 7,000 hours of flying time under his belt. Behind the two pilots was flight engineer Ahmed Idris. At 33 years old, he was the least experienced member of this flight crew, with just over 3,000 hours total experience. On this evening, these 3 pilots and their 309 passengers and crew would fall victim to a complex web of systemic inadequacies, completely beyond their control. The foundations of the pyramid, which had supported their safe passage through the skies for all these years, was about to reveal its fatal flaws. Once the pilots had completed their checklists and all of the passengers had boarded, Flight 763 pushed back from the gate. The countdown to disaster had now begun. The time was 6:20 in the evening. As the Saudi jet pushed back, Kazakh Flight 1907 was in the middle of its descent towards the airport. It was now 90 nautical miles away, or about 170 kilometers. Along with 27 passengers, there were 10 crew on board. Even though this particular aircraft, a Soviet-designed plane called the Aviation 76, was just 4 years old, the technology on board was ancient. Of the 10 crew on board this flight, 5 of them were in the cockpit. To accommodate all of them, the cockpit was split into 2 decks, an upper deck and a lower deck. On the upper deck, sitting in the left-hand seat, was 44-year-old Captain Alexander Robertovich Cherapanov. He was joined to his right by 37-year-old First Officer Ermek Kozametovich Zangarov. Behind him was 50-year-old Flight Engineer Alexander Alexandrovich Chuprov, and 41-year-old Radio Operator Igor Alexeyevich Rep. And finally, sitting on the lower deck, in what might be called an original glass cockpit, was a navigator, 51-year-old Zahambek Jusenovich Apravev. This was an experienced crew. Even the least experienced pilot, the first officer, had almost 7,000 hours of flying experience. But there was one area in which the crew were all badly lacking: their level of English. This fact, combined with some quirks of the aircraft they were flying, would lead to disastrous consequences as the aircraft neared Delhi. At 33 minutes past 6, the controller cleared Flight 1907 down to 18,000 feet. The radio operator acknowledged this clearance. As per the captain's instructions, he would be handling all ATC communications for the approach and landing into Delhi. And it was a rather unusual approach. In fact, every plane departing and arriving into Delhi flew an unusual route. In 1996, Indian airspace was split about 50-50 between military and civilian control. There was a strict divide between the two airspaces, with civilian aircraft being forbidden from flying in military airspace, and military aircraft being forbidden from flying in civilian airspace. Delhi's airport was particularly heavily affected by this divide. The airport had only been handed over to civilian control the previous year, and almost all of the airspace surrounding it was still controlled by the military. The only way civilian aircraft could get in or out of the airport was along one narrow corridor. This stretched from the airport out to a waypoint called Lunka, 330 kilometers to the west. It was this corridor which Kazakh Flight 1907 was now flying along, on its way into Delhi. It was also the corridor along which Saudi Flight 763 would be flying, as it departed the airport. If it strikes you as bad design that departing and arriving aircraft fly on the same path, you're not alone. Controllers at Delhi had been protesting this system for years, but nothing had been done about it. We're about to see the consequences of this in action. At 33 minutes past 6, just as the Kazakh pilots received their descent clearance, the Saudi pilots lined their massive 747 up with runway 28 and began their takeoff roll. A few moments later, they and their 309 passengers and crew were airborne, climbing out over the densely populated city of Delhi. It was a good day for flying. The winds were relatively calm, and while there was some smog low to the ground, the visibility was much better up in the air. After takeoff, the crew of Flight 763 switched their radios over to Delhi approach control and made first contact. The controller, V.K. Dutta, was responsible for all departing and arriving traffic in and out of the airport. He identified the Saudi aircraft on his radar and instructed them to climb to 10,000 feet initially. Much like the pilots in the Kazakh jet, Dutta was using antiquated technology for his work. The kind of radar he had not been state-of-the-art since the 1960s. It didn't get sent any information from the aircraft electronically, but rather a radar dish at the airport sent out a signal in all directions and picked up when this signal was reflected off an aircraft. As a result of this, it could only tell the position of planes, and not their altitude, or even which aircraft they were. Dutta had to take the pilot's word for it when they gave him this information. For more than a decade, there had been plans in place to install a modern radar system, but bureaucratic forces had stymied the installation of this technology. So, sitting on top of this ancient infrastructure, keeping passenger planes separated at an airport which handled a takeoff and landing every 4 minutes, was one man. One man who had to work with one piece of information per aircraft, and who had to do it all in one narrow corridor. Because there was only one route in and out of the airport, the only way the controller could keep planes separated was to keep them at different altitudes. The international standard for this vertical separation is 1,000 feet. The controller's plan was to keep the inbound Kazakh plane at a higher altitude and to let the Saudi plane pass beneath it. As the Saudi 747 continued its climb to 10,000 feet, the Kazakh plane was descending through 23,000 feet, on its way down to 18,000. It was just over 70 nautical miles from the airport at this point, or 130 kilometers. The radio operator, sitting behind the pilots, reported their position to air traffic control. The controller cleared the flight down to 15,000 feet, and asked them to report when they had reached this altitude. The radio operator acknowledged this, and the flight continued its descent. As both aircraft were now tuned in to the same radio frequency, the pilots in each plane were able to hear the transmissions from the other plane, and their conversations with air traffic control. Listening out to other aircraft in order to build a mental picture of what's going on in the airspace is a key way by which pilots can maintain their situational awareness. This provides an added layer of protection for planes, especially in the busy airspace around airports. In the cockpit of the Kazakh plane, a conversation now took place between the radio operator and the pilots. They needed to convert the altitude the controller had given them, 15,000 feet, into meters. This was because most of the altimeters in their cockpit showed altitude in meters, including the first officer's altimeter. This was important because he was the one flying the plane. Only the captain's altimeter and the navigator's altimeter on the lower deck showed altitude in feet. The radio operator checked his conversion chart and told the pilots that 15,000 feet was equal to 4,570 meters. They acknowledged this and continued their descent. 1 minute after the controller had cleared the Kazakh flight down to 15,000 feet, the Saudi Arabian pilots told the controller that they were level at 10,000 feet. They asked the controller if they could climb higher. The controller then cleared Saudi Flight 763 up to 14,000 feet. This was as close as the controller was going to allow the planes to get. He was going to let the Saudi plane pass 1,000 feet below the Kazakh plane, and then, once they had passed each other, he would issue further climbing and descending instructions respectively. Just to be sure, the radio operator on the Kazakh flight asked the navigator to confirm that his conversion between feet and meters was correct. The navigator confirmed that the conversion was correct, but importantly, as we'll see shortly, the pilots didn't say anything. Despite being the only person on the Kazakh plane who was in direct contact with air traffic control, the radio operator didn't have an altimeter. In order to see what altitude his plane was at, he had to lean awkwardly over to one side to take a look at the pilot's instruments. The two aircraft were now just a few minutes away from the point in the sky where they would meet. The Saudi plane was climbing, and the Kazakh plane was descending. But right on cue, the Saudi pilots called air traffic control and reported that they were now approaching 14,000 feet. They asked to climb higher, but the controller told them to stay at their current altitude. He was going to keep them at 14,000 until the Kazakh plane had passed 1,000 feet overhead. All was normal on board Saudi Flight 763. The pilots were aware of the inbound aircraft, but they were not concerned about it. They had flown in and out of Delhi plenty of times, and had not encountered any major issues with other aircraft. Within a few moments, they levelled off at 14,000 feet, just as they had been asked to do. In the back of the plane, the passengers were oblivious to the fact that a few miles ahead, behind a dark cloud, another aircraft was bearing down on them with tremendous speed. Over the next few seconds, a sequence of events would unfold which would shock the world of aviation and raise serious questions about the safety of flying in Indian airspace. The controller asked Kazakh Flight 1907 to confirm its position relative to the airport. The radio operator told him that they had now reached 15,000 feet and were 46 nautical miles from the airport. Strangely, while the plane was indeed 46 miles from the airport, it was not, as the radio operator said, at 15,000 feet. Instead, at that moment, the plane was descending through 16,400 feet. It would not reach 15,000 for another minute or so. Why then did the radio operator tell the controller that they had reached 15,000? The reason behind this strange transmission may hold part of the key for what happened next. And that reason was likely very simple. The radio operator didn't have his own altimeter. It's likely that he was simply unable to easily peer around to check the pilot's altimeters, so he just guessed that the pilots had now levelled off at 15,000. What's bad here is not that the radio operator misjudged the plane's altitude, but rather, it's what this transmission implies about the communication between the crew on board. This was a flight crew who, fundamentally, were not on the same page as one another. The controller told the Kazakh flight to stay at 15,000 and warned that there was a Saudi Boeing 747 at their 12 o'clock position 10 miles away, which would cross them in 5 miles. He asked the flight to report whether they could see the other aircraft. In the front of the cockpit, the two pilots began chatting amongst themselves, looking for the Saudi jet. If it had been a clear night, they would easily have been able to spot the lights of the 747 out their windscreens. But with thick clouds ahead of them, there was no way they could see the other plane. The radio operator asked the controller to repeat the distance between his plane and the Saudi plane. "Traffic is at 8 miles, level 140, said the controller. The radio operator reported that he and his crew were now looking for the other aircraft. This is where things started to go really wrong. As the seconds ticked by and the crew looked for the 747 ahead of them, they began to slip below their cleared altitude of 15,000 feet. Second by second, the Kazakh plane descended. And then it entered a cloud. Both aircraft were now in the same cloud, hurtling towards each other at a combined speed of well over 1,000 kilometers per hour. The reason that the Kazakh plane slipped below its cleared altitude is still shrouded in mystery. Some have suggested that the pilots, with their poor knowledge of English, misunderstood the controller's report of traffic at 14,000 feet, and instead took it as clearance for them to descend to 14,000 feet. It's also possible that the first officer, with his Soviet altimeter, hadn't heard the radio operator and navigator convert between feet and meters earlier on. Perhaps he knew that he was supposed to level off at 15,000, but he just didn't know what this was in meters. But one thing is clear. Had these planes been fitted with TCAS, or Traffic Collision Avoidance System, which was mandatory in the United States at the time, they would have immediately seen the danger. By this point, less than 40 seconds from collision, the technology would have been frantically ordering the pilots to climb away from the danger.
Climb now. Climb now.
But this last line of defense had not been made mandatory in India, or any other part of the world outside the US by this point. In the control tower, the human last line of defense, VK Dutta, had no way of knowing that one of the blips on his screen was not doing what he had asked of it. He watched blissfully on as the two blips drew ever closer together. The Saudi pilots had overheard the controller's conversation with the Kazakh pilots, and they too were blissfully unaware that the Kazakh plane was not, as it had reported to be, level at 15,000 feet. The seconds were counting down as the two planes screamed towards each other through the cloud. All of a sudden, at 6:39 p.m. and 57 seconds, the radio operator shouted, "Hold the level." He had probably seen the pilot's altimeters showing that they had gotten too low. Shockingly, the captain asked, "What level were we given?" The two planes were now 18 seconds from collision. The flight engineer yelled out, "Maintain," and the radio operator clarified this by shouting, "Keep to level 150, don't descend." Finally, the captain realized that he had made an horrendous mistake. He disconnected the autopilot and ordered the first officer to increase engine power. The engine spooled up loudly to high power, and the radio operator shouted, "Get to 150 because on the 140, that one!" All of the crew saw the lights of the 747 filling their windscreens, but it was too late. The left wing of the Kazakh plane collided with the Boeing's left engines, igniting a massive explosion. The two planes continued forward for a few hundred meters before tumbling down to earth, spiraling in their own flames. The controller watched on as the two blips on his radar merged and then disappeared. Shortly after, he heard a voice over the radio in Arabic. It was the Saudi plane. He called both of the flights multiple times, but got no response. A minute after colliding, both planes slammed into the ground. There were no survivors. With 349 people dead, this crash remains the worst mid-air collision in history, and the third worst air accident in history. After the accident, different parties quickly sought to apportion blame to the various people involved. The final report into the incident emphasizes the crucial role that the Kazakh pilots played, in that they were the ones who had slipped below their assigned altitude. With the sheer number of people in the cockpit, it became very easy for a working culture to develop whereby different tasks were seen as "not my problem." In this case, no crew member took responsibility for ensuring that the plane stayed at its assigned altitude. It didn't help that the technology on board the Kazakh plane was practically ancient. Not only did the aircraft not have TCAS, but it didn't even have something which all Western passenger aircraft had had since the 1960s, an altitude alert tone. This would have alerted the pilots when they were nearing their assigned altitude. And on top of this, the plane's autopilot didn't even have an altitude capture mode, so it couldn't level off automatically when the selected altitude was reached. These are incredibly basic autopilot functions, which had been in other aircraft for decades. Either of them would have prevented the collision entirely. All of this, when combined with the grossly inadequate and outdated airspace infrastructure, made this accident all but inevitable. As a direct result of this accident, in 1999, India became the second country in the world to mandate the use of TCAS in its airspace. Other nations soon followed, and now it's standard across the world. Delhi's airport, and Indian airspace more generally, also finally got the overhaul it so desperately needed. All major airports in the country now have modern radar systems, and the airspace surrounding them has largely been handed over to civilian control. Now, as much as 500,000 people safely take to the sky in India each day, a figure that is growing year on year. Ultimately, while the confusion and disorderliness in the Kazakh cockpit caused this accident, inadequate infrastructure and outdated technology sealed the fate of all 349 people on board the two planes. It's just unfortunate that this wake-up call came at the cost of so many lives. Thanks for watching this episode. If you'd like to see more episodes like this, you can watch this playlist up here. And if you'd like to support the channel and join all of these people, you can sign up on Patreon, and I've put the link to that just at the bottom of the screen here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.